Hi, this is Misha, and this video is on the evolution in the early self-loading rifles. That way we kind of compare and contrast, because these guns started to appear in World War I and were in pretty widespread use by World War II. Now, there were a lot of prototypes in small production run guns beginning as early as 1900, even some before. Today we're just talking about military guns. Also, some of the early ones were select fire, which are problematic to get today. So, with those caveats in mind, start off with a few and kind of compare and contrast them. First off, we have the French RSC model 1917. This rifle is chambered for 8x50 Lebel and was used in World War I. Now, the French had been interested in a self-loading rifle for a long time. In 1901, they tested the INT B5 prototype, which led into the INT 6. And these were early direct impingement guns using rotating style bolts. In fact, in 1913, they were really toying with the idea of switching from the 1886 Lebel bolt action over to a semi-automatic rifle as general issue, but war got in the way. The idea re-emerged in 1915, though, with this gun here. It was originally sold to the French military as a conversion kit for the Lebel, which it's not. It does use a few parts, though. To be fair, it does. It uses the same stock, a modified handguard, same trigger guard, same barrel bands. It does even use a modified barrel. So it uses a few Lebel parts. This gun operates using a long stroke system, and it does have a port in the barrel. You can see it's a little buggered up there, the screw. Basically, you loosened or tighten the screw to adjust the gas flow. It uses a rotating bolt with that long stroke system, as you saw. It does have a hold open here. It's a manual hold open, but it does have one. On the other hand, though, it fed from proprietary clips. You would drop this open, load your 5-round clip inside, and close it up. That was really its biggest shortcoming. The clips were pretty weak. Again, they were proprietary. They couldn't share them with other guns such as the Berthier. In addition to that, the semi-automatic system, the gas port was awfully small. It was easily fouled in the dirt and the grime of the trenches. The French factory of MAT would produce about 82,000 of these in 1917 and 1918, and they would see some use in 1918 during the war. Some pros, some cons. But a lot had to do with the magazine system, and the cartridge itself. The 8x50 rimmed cartridge was not well suited to self-loaders. In 1918, in November, right as the war was ending, they would introduce the model 1918, which is a much improved version of this. Better gas system. We went to using Berthier 5-round clips. We had an automatic last round hold open, and it was a little shorter and lighter. As you can tell, this thing is as long as a Lebel. We have a full-length barrel on this critter, about 29 inches. It also takes a Lebel bayonet and a Lebel sling, and has Lebel sights. But it was an early attempt at a self-loader, and one that's often overlooked today. Now, in that same war, World War I, it is worth noting that other people did have self-loading or even select fire rifles. One that's often thought of today is the Mexican 1907 Mondragon which was built in Switzerland, but only a few thousand of those were made, and most of them ended up in Germany. It fired 7mm Mauser. So that was World War I. There was really no major use of self-loading rifles in that war. However, it inspired a whole generation of rifles. This is the US M1 Garand. And Garand was directly inspired by the RSC 1917, specifically the trigger group. He almost lifted the entire trigger group out of this gun to put in this gun. They're very similar internally. Also, the operating system is not dissimilar. We have an asymmetrical op rod coming back to cock a bolt from a system. Now, the original Garands used the gas trap or bang principle, and then later they would go to a gas port and a long stroke. This would be developed in the 1920s and 30s, and officially adopted in the US in 1936. And much has been made about this was the first self-loading rifle to be adopted for general mass issue. Again, it fired 30-06. It used 8-round in-block clips. They would switch to the long stroke piston in 1939 and go into full-scale production in 1940 at Springfield and Winchester. They would make these throughout World War II and through Korea, and in total over 6,250,000 would be made before production ended in 1957. And this would serve in the military until that year as standard issue, and would be in reserve service up till about 1970. So for an early self-loading rifle, it was pretty darn successful, and it would spin off into the M14 and many other designs in the 50s as well. But the Garand we pretty much all know and love. Now, something that's often overlooked is Russia. Now, this is an SVT-40. This one was produced in 1940. But Russia was also interested in self-loading and automatic guns. In fact, in World War I, they fielded a few hundred Model 1916 Fedorov automatic rifles. Now, in the war, these were select fire guns firing the 6.5 Arisaka round. Before the war, however, the Fedorov was going to be a semi-only rifle firing a new 6.5mm Fedorov proprietary cartridge. But the war got in the way. Russia was definitely strapped for cash in that war, so not a lot happened there. In the end, about 3,000 Fedorovs would be built, many of them in Soviet Russia. And it, because it was select fire and firing a light rifle cartridge, some might call it the first assault rifle or early progenitor of the assault rifle. Anyway, throughout the 20s, work would continue in Russia on automatic and self-loading guns. Stalin was very interested in them. 1930s, we had trials. Eventually, the AVS-36 by Simonov would be adopted in 1936, and it was a select fire gun firing 7.62 by 54 rimmed, and it was adopted with the intention of making it standard issue and fully replacing the Mosin Nagant. However, it had major issues, a lot to do with the fact that it was an automatic rifle firing 7.62 by 54R, and not to mention production and other things. So in 1938, after another round of trials, the SVT-38, which was a design by Fedor Tokarev, replaced the AVS-36. Now, the SVT-38 was semi-automatic only, still firing 7.62 by 54R, but they learned their lessons. And again, it was meant to be standard issue. But again, the SVT-38 was used in 1939-1940 during the Winter War in Finland, and several shortcomings were seen, mostly to do with how light it was made and therefore weak, and it was awfully long and cumbersome, and just had reliability issues. In the end, that's what led to this gun here. The SVT-40, adopted in 1940, is an improved version of the SVT-38. Mechanically, it's the same. We have a tilting bolt system. We are magazine fed now with a 10-round detachable box mag. One of the issues they had with the SVT-38 was the mag was easily lost, so they put a lock on it. You can easily remove it, and then when you put it back in, you can lock it in place so soldiers would not accidentally drop it. Also, the original gun had a two-piece stock, which was known for breaking. It was kind of dovetailed together. They went to a single piece. They changed up the cleaning rod. They made it a little bit shorter, a little bit lighter. You get the idea. This is an interesting gun in the sense that it has a long barrel, about 24, 25 inches, but it is a lighter gun than the M1 Garand with its 24-inch barrel. It's a very long, skinny, svelte gun. We also have a very effective muzzle brake on the end, which also doubles as a bayonet lug. It uses a short stroke gas piston above the barrel here. It is also adjustable here, so you can adjust the gas flow. So we have a gas port with a gas piston tapping this carrier with a tilting bolt, detachable mag. Also early on, scope rail mounts, I should say, were standard on these. And so Russia had an interest in self-loading rifles since the early days. And originally they wanted to produce 2 million of these a year and re-equip the entire Russian military. But again, it didn't come. They put these into production, the SVT-40 in 1940. They would be produced at 3 different arsenals, but then the Germans invaded and they only had made about 1 million by the end of 1941. In the end, the exigencies of war, plus this thing kept having some issues. It was vertically stringing when fired a lot. It still was pretty light and fragile, especially for the cartridge. And again, they could make so many more 9130 Mauser Nagants for every SVT-40 they made. Production would slow in 1942 and continue to slow in 1943 and 44, and eventually these would be officially discontinued in January of 45. In the end, only about 1,600,000 of these were made. They made about 100,000 SVT-38s, and they made about 60,000 AVS-36s. So still pretty large numbers, but you know, they tried, but in the end it just didn't work out. And a lot had to do with the 7.62-54 cartridge. Not only was it a large cartridge, it was also rimmed, and rimmed have always had issues in self-loading rifles going back to the RSC 1917. But definitely an interesting gun. Its tilting bolt was used in a lot of other guns before and after. In fact, this was copied a lot and would influence some later guns. Definitely an interesting World War II rifle, and really kind of led into the SKS and the AK-47 for that matter. Now, Germany wasn't as interested in a self-loading infantry rifle as the US and Russia. They experimented some in the 30s, but their main infantry tactic was to have a machine gun supported by riflemen. They also developed a submachine gun with the MP38, MP40, thinking this would be sufficient. But after Operation Barbarossa, when they invaded Russia in 1941 and they went up against the SVT-40, they actually respected it quite a great bit, maybe even more than the Russians. Quite a few German soldiers would use captured SVT-40s even. So in 1941, the Nazi government contracted with Mauser and Walther to make a self-loading rifle for the 8mm Mauser 7.92 by 57 cartridge. And they had a few weird requirements. One, they could not have a hole in the barrel, so no gas port. Two, it had to be able to be operated as a bolt action. And three, it could not have external moving parts. Well, Mauser tried to meet all these requirements with the infinitely complicated, although very cool, G41M. Well, only about 7,000 of those were made, and they didn't work well. They were a mousetrap. They had a lot of parts, and that led to issues. Walther, on the other hand, developed the G41W, which was adopted into German service as the Gewehr 41. in 1942. Now, they did listen to the German government, and that they did not put a gas port in the barrel. Instead, they used the gas trap, the bang system, much like the early Garands. This is why this is so fat out here. This is actually all part of the gas system. Gas is trapped here. It pushes a cylindrical piston back here, which hits an op rod, which comes back and pushes the bolt carrier. Now, the bolt itself actually uses two locking wings, which they basically stole from the DP machine gun, light machine gun from Russia. So it's interesting. This fed from a fixed 10-round magazine, and you would top it off with, there you go, stripper clips, 2 of them. Have a wing safety back here, which would actually be one of the problem points of this entire design, and a dust cover. So they listened to the government when it came to the barrel. When it came to the operating like a bolt action, they said, hey, that's good enough. It's close enough to a bolt action. You can manually operate it. When it came to the no external moving parts, they just ignored it because it was a ridiculous requirement. Obviously, it worked out because they won the contract and Mauser did not. This has a lot of elements from the Mauser too, the Mauser K98, I should say. We have a pass-through sling slot here. Mauser-style cupped butt plate. Takes a Mauser bayonet and cleaning rod. The barrel bands are very similar. And this version actually has the synthetic Durafol upper handguard. Now, these were sent into the field, and soldiers, while they liked having a self-loading rifle, were not real fond of it. Even though this only has a 22-inch barrel, it's very heavy. It's actually heavier than the Garand, and definitely heavier by more than a pound of the SVT because of this gas trap system. This is just ridiculous. You're adding a lot of stuff in front, and all the weight's pretty much in front. I mean, the balancing point of this gun is about here. Also, we have the fixed magazine, and it just wasn't that reliable. As I said in a couple other videos, the problem with the gas trap system, it works fine for sporting guns, but when you try to use it on a military gun, this cone fills up with crud from the burnt propellant very quickly and gums up the entire action. So it required very, very routine maintenance, almost religious. On top of that, it was pretty expensive to produce by the standards of the day, and by 1942 the war wasn't going so great for the Germans. This would be produced at Walther in Louis, Berlin, and they would build, and no one really knows, the lowest number you see is about 40,000. Based on serials, that's way too low. The highest number you see is about 140,000. That seems a bit much. But since most of these went to the Eastern Front, we really don't know. So, we'll call it 100,000 were made in 1942 and 1943. And this was Germany's first self-loading rifle to be officially adopted as a Gewehr and go into production and so on and so forth. But they made a lot of the same mistakes of other early guns, such as the first Garand with the bang system, the fixed magazine, and just in general using the full power cartridge. But at least they didn't try to make it select fire. It was a semi-only, so that was nice. But mainly it was just the weight and reliability with this critter. And that led to this here. This is the Walther G43. This is an improved version of the G41. First tried out in early 1943, and what started to be produced and fielded in October, November of 1943. They would only get a couple of thousand of these into the field by the end of that year. It uses the same operating system as the G41, except they moved the cocking handle to the left side. They also made a scope rail on the right standard. They went to detachable 10-round mag. We're still firing 8mm Mauser. The biggest change, we went away from the gas trap system of the G41 to a gas port and short stroke piston directly copied off the SVT-40. For that matter, the detachable mag is pretty much copied. They would delete the bayonet lug, and they would just lighten up the entire front end of this gun. Early ones like this would have a threaded muzzle, later ones wouldn't. That's neither here nor there. They would make changes as the war would go on, just to simplify production. This would be the closest thing that Germany would have to a general issue self-loading full-power rifle in World War II. Yes, they would have the MP40 submachine gun, and yes, they would have the MP44, that many consider to be the first assault rifle. But this was officially the replacement for the Kar98K. And as you can see, they did take the gas system and the magazine concept straight from the SVT-40 because it worked. And this was a much more reliable, much lighter, much better balanced gun than the G41, but it suffered from its own issues, most of it having to do with rushed development and wartime expediencies. For one thing, to keep it reliable in all environments, they just put a large gas port in the barrel, and then therefore the whole system is overgassed. But yeah, this would be what Germany would use towards the end of World War II. They would produce about 500,000 of these at 3 different factories, and production would continue right up until the end of the war. But after the war, the ones that were made would be used in West and East Germany, but that was pretty much the end of that whole production line. Now, kind of more obscure, we have the Swedish AG42, often called the Ljungman. This is an interesting self-loading rifle just because it kind of came out of nowhere. It borrowed the tilting bolt from the SVT-38, but it has a very unique charging system, all its own. As you saw, it feeds from a detachable mag holding 10 rounds. This fires 6.5mm Swedish, 6.5 by 55, and it operates using the direct gas impingement system like the early French guns. Sweden decided it wanted to adopt a self-loading rifle in 1938, and once World War II kicked off and Germany was so nearby, even though Germany was ostensibly more or less an ally, they made them nervous. So in 1941, Erich Eckhart quickly developed this gun here, and it went into production in 1942. Between then and 1944, they would produce about 30,000 at the Carl Gustaf factory. But it was never really intended to replace the Mauser in Swedish service. Rather, it was a frontline gun to issue to the best, most elite troops, or the most troops likely to see combat. They just let aggressors know that Sweden could make an automatic rifle. So it did its job very well. Once World War II died down, they didn't need any more, they quit producing them. And for such a rush job, this is a very good gun. It is heavy, it is relatively long. We have a 25-inch barrel. We have a integrated into the barrel muzzle brake system. Typical cleaning rod. It takes a typical Swedish bayonet. Full length here. It's a pretty hefty, solid gun, very thick stock. The cocking system is definitely unique. It would make M1 Garand thumb look like a boo-boo. But other than that, it's a very dependable rifle with a very nice trigger. Easy enough to use safety, good sights. Now this is an AG42B. Nearly every single AG42 from the 40s would be updated to the AG42B around 1953. It was just an improved version. They originally, instead of having these bumps on the cover, they would have simple serrations. They would add this brass deflector. They would change the rear sight, adding this wheel here. And they would go to a stainless steel gas tube. Just minor improvements, most of them for ergonomics and soldier convenience and comfort. But when people think about countries that adopted a self-loading rifle before and during World War II, a lot of times they don't think about Sweden. And in a lot of ways, they were on the cutting edge. Again, they didn't make many of these, but this is pretty much it's not really a copy of anything. It's inspired by older French guns and the SVT-38, but they did a better job than Germany did with the G41 and G43, and they did it in less time with the expenditure of less resources. And then again, they weren't in war. They were just kind of, well, they were in the middle of it, but they weren't, Sweden's position. Now moving on, getting back to France, this is an MAS model 1944. After the RSC 1917, France did not abandon the self-loading concept. Rather, they just slowed down throughout the 20s. They tried a few different prototypes. It was the MAC 1928-29 that first introduced the tilting bolt, which is used in this one, also very similar to the SVT and the Ljungman there. And later they would go to the MAS model 1938, and the improved version, the 3840, was supposed to go into full-scale production along with the MAS 1936. However, Germany got in the way, war, so on and so forth. But as soon as France was liberated, they reintroduced the 1940 design with a few minor updates. First off, they went to a detachable mag. The original 1940 had a fixed mag. They also introduced, retained, I should say, the spike bayonet from the 1936 bolt action style. We have a full-length barrel of about 23 inches. This uses a direct gas impingement operating system, as like I said, with a tilting bolt. Very simple, very dependable. They would adopt this in 1944 and put it into production in 1945. They would make about 6,000 for mostly the French Navy before the end of World War II. Well, I mean, at the end that year after. And while this exact version, the 1944 version, wouldn't see widespread adoption, it would lead to the 1949, which is very similar to this, except without the bayonet and with an improved rear sight. And that would be the standard issue gun in France into the 1970s. It's just it's interesting because it is direct impingement, much like the AR-15. Nice, simple, reliable gun. It really shows a lot of the lessons learned with the RSC 1917. And interestingly enough, it uses a lot of the same parts as the bolt action 1936. Namely, the furniture, as I said, the bayonet, the sights are very similar. Trigger guard's very similar. So there's a lot of interoperability between this and their current issue, or their then current issue bolt action. But France definitely didn't give up on the automatic or self-loading rifle. Oh, and I forgot to mention, like the MAS 36, this fires 7.5 by 54 French, which was a vast improvement over 8mm Mauser. We go to a rimless round, and all things are better with rimless rounds. And finally, this is really the last of that style of gun. This is an FN model 1949. Specifically, this is an Egyptian contract. It too uses a tilting bolt, very much like several others. We have a fixed mag. We have a short stroke gas piston system, very much like the SVT, G43, and later would be very much used in the M1 Garand, the FAL. Takes a Mauser style bayonet. Have a 22-inch barrel. This particular one fires 8mm Mauser. The one version used by Belgium would fire 30-06. Other versions would fire 7mm. Again, it was the last of the self-loading semi-automatic full-power rifles. It's also worth noting that the Belgian version was capable of full auto, but still had a 10-round mag. Now, the reason I'm including it in this video, I nearly didn't. These were made in 1949, 1950s, but work began at FN during the 1930s. FN had been producing a licensed version of the Mauser since the 20s, and so that's why some of this has some kind of Mauser-esque elements. And Germany would invade, of course, and so plans were put on hold. Walther G43 would go to England, and then he would come back to Belgium in 1946, and then begin work on this, and then the FAL. And really, FN sold these to fund the FAL project. But the FN-49 did see combat in Korea, so it did see use. So the FN-49 was really the last of the old world battle rifles, and at the same time, it was the immediate forerunner of a whole new generation in the FAL. So it's really an interesting step. It began development back in the 20s, and they're still made in the 50s, and a lot of countries would keep these in second line service through the 70s and even 80s. For example, Argentina had a few rechambered for 308 7.62 NATO used in the Falklands War. It's not really revolutionary in any way. The tilting bolt by this point was very tried and true. Has a lot of Mauser elements, as I said, like, you know, screws and bayonet. The gas system has by this point been used in a lot of other guns. And the fixed 10-round mag is an interesting thing. I mean, it's really a throwback. It's the one part that I don't know why they didn't go to, if nothing else, a detachable 10. But there are pros and cons, so that's what they did. But yeah, this was really just a look at the evolution of the military self-loading rifle from way back with the RSC 1917, which introduced the long stroke system. It has a rotating bolt. Then we moved to the Garand, which continued the use of the long stroke, and now we have a much more updated style of rotating bolt, which has been used in a lot of modern rifles still today. The SVT has the tilting bolt and the short stroke gas piston, which is again still in use. It also has the detachable mag, curved double stack, double feed type mag, which is used a lot still. The G41, not a whole lot, you know, left of this. The flappers and the bolt have fallen away, except for maybe in a few machine guns still in use. The banging system is definitely well out of use. The fixed mag is, again, well out of use. G43 didn't really fare a whole lot better. We are using the short stroke system out of the SVT and the detachable mag from it, that style. So I guess you could say those have been kind of continued on, but it is really dead end after World War II, both of them. The Ljungman, very interesting. I don't think they ever intended to make a legacy out of it. It was kind of a wartime expedient, and it did very well. It is interesting for kind of popularizing the gas impingement, the direct gas impingement system. So that's nice. It also uses the tried and true by now tilting bolt. Although the finger-eating recoil system is, or charging system I should say, is probably a good thing that no one really copied that outside of the Hakim. Then the French gun, we're continuing to use the direct impingement system along with the tilting bolt. A good combo, simple, dependable, reliable. Nicely machined receiver, wood furniture, not too large and heavy. We're getting more and more modern here with this gun. And then finally we get back to the FN-49, which is just a hair's breadth really away from the FAL, which in turn led into the G3 and all those other battle rifles. And then of course that goes on to the generation we have today of assault rifles firing smaller intermediate cartridges. But all of these guns, when they were made, fired the full power rifle cartridge of the day and time, and were really the interim step between bolt actions and automatics. They were pretty briefly lived, with probably the Garand being the most successful out of them, seeing the longest service, but none of them saw anywhere near the service life of, say, the AK-47, FAL, M16, G3, any of those, or the previous bolt actions like the Enfield or Mauser Nagant for that matter. Anyway, I thought this might be an interesting video. We have individual videos looking more at each of these. We're talking more about their history and production and military use, so this was kind of more of an overview and comparison. We have links to those in the description. If you're interested, please click. If you like the video, please also click. We really appreciate when you do. If you haven't already subscribed, if you have time, we'd appreciate it if you did that as well. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. As always, this is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.